I finally don't have to worry about her anymore," Jessica whispered to her friends, just loud enough for the words to reach me as I stood by the corner of the small chapel. The air inside smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood, the sunlight streaming through the tall stained glass casting a soft mosaic of colors across the floor. Guests murmured in low tones, some seated with hands folded, others standing quietly, exchanging condolences, yet the atmosphere felt unusually tense, almost hollow, as if the warmth one would expect at a memorial had been replaced by a careful performance. I adjusted the silver bracelet on my wrist, a gift from Daniel many years ago, and let my eyes sweep across the familiar faces, noting the polite distance kept by those who once knew him intimately. Jessica's smile was precise, measured, a perfect mask that did not reach her eyes, yet the casual confidence in her tone suggested she had been planning something long before this day arrived. I reminded myself to breathe, to keep steady, because reacting now would do nothing but reveal what I had already suspected for weeks, that she had an agenda hidden beneath the veil of grief everyone assumed she shared. The polished oak floor creaked softly under my feet as I shifted slightly, my gaze lingering on the portrait of Daniel placed near the altar, the frame reflecting a muted golden glow from the afternoon sun. Memories flickered unbidden, Daniel's easy laugh, the way he would insist on bringing me coffee on Saturday mornings, his careful hand on my shoulder when the world seemed overwhelming. The contrast between the warmth of those memories and the cold precision of Jessica's demeanor made my chest tighten, yet I maintained the stillness of my posture, standing just far enough to be unnoticed, yet close enough to catch every inflection, every subtle gesture. She turned slightly, her hair brushing the shoulder of the navy dress she had chosen, and I noticed the way she tilted her head, the angle just enough to allow a whisper to pass to her friends without any of the elders noticing. My mind began tracing the possibilities, the quiet calculations that could accompany such a statement. What did she finally intend to do, and who would be affected by it? I reminded myself that I had navigated storms in this family before, moments where loyalty was tested and patience became a tool of survival. And now, in the midst of polished sympathy cards and soft organ music, that patience would be my shield once more. A faint rustle of the program sheets drew my attention downward, and I saw my name printed in the list of speakers, yet Jessica's expression suggested that even this small acknowledgement was part of her careful orchestration. I allowed a thin smile, almost imperceptible, to pass over my lips, a quiet acknowledgement to myself that observation and restraint could reveal more than any confrontation. The whispers continued, fragments of plans and intentions carried on her carefully controlled cadence, and I let them wash over me, while the soft murmurs of the crowd created a subtle backdrop. I reminded myself to remain outwardly composed, for any hint of suspicion would invite her to adjust, to hide her intentions even more cleverly. The sunlight shifted as the hour passed, touching the edges of the chapel pews and casting long, warm stripes across the floor, each ray illuminating dust motes suspended in the air, like tiny witnesses to the careful attention I was giving to every subtle movement. Every gesture, every slight hesitation in her words, became a piece of a puzzle, and though I did not yet see the full picture, I felt the faint thrill of understanding, the beginning of clarity forming in the quiet. I leaned slightly against the cool stone wall, the chill grounding me as I prepared to continue my silent observation, knowing that when the time came to act, I would do so with the precision and calm that Daniel had always admired in me, letting patience become the unseen force that would turn knowledge into quiet power, all while the rest of the world remained blissfully unaware of the currents moving beneath the veneer of sorrow and etiquette. The chapel doors closed softly behind the last group of guests, leaving behind a quieter space where the echo of polite condolences still seemed to linger in the air like a fading memory. I remained standing near the side wall, my hands loosely folded in front of me, maintaining the same composed posture as before, though my attention had shifted entirely to the movements near the front rows. Jessica had moved with practiced ease between guests, accepting brief embraces, offering measured nods, her expression never slipping too far from what others expected of a grieving daughter-in-law. Yet there was something carefully controlled in her presence, as if every step, every pause, every tilt of her head had been rehearsed long before this day arrived. I watched as she leaned toward a small group of women near the second row, her voice low, almost playful, a tone that did not belong in a room meant for remembrance. She lifted her hand slightly as she spoke, a subtle gesture that drew the others closer, and I could see the faint curve of her smile before she lowered her gaze, as if sharing something delicate and private. I did not move, but I listened more carefully now, letting the surrounding sounds of soft footsteps and distant murmurs fade into the background. The name of my son, Daniel, appeared in fragments of conversation nearby, spoken with sympathy, yet Jessica's tone seemed to pull it into another context entirely, one that I could not yet fully understand. I felt the weight of unanswered questions settle quietly inside me, not heavy enough to disturb my outward calm, but present enough to sharpen my focus. A young man from the church staff walked past carrying a tray of empty cups, and I stepped slightly aside, allowing him to pass without breaking my attention. From my position, I could now see Jessica more clearly, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested she believed the most important part of the day had already been managed successfully. She glanced briefly toward the altar, then back to her friends, and that was when I noticed it again, the same faint spark in her expression I had seen earlier, as though she was waiting for a moment when she no longer had to maintain appearances. My thoughts moved carefully, connecting small details that might otherwise have seemed insignificant. The way she had insisted on arranging the seating chart, the way she had controlled the timing of the speeches, the way she had gently but firmly redirected certain conversations away from Daniel's earlier life. None of it alone was definitive, but together it formed a pattern that I could not ignore. I pressed my fingers lightly against the edge of the stone wall beside me, grounding myself in its cool texture while I continued to observe. Jessica excused herself from the group and began walking slowly toward the side corridor that led away from the main hall, her steps unhurried, almost casual, as if she were simply taking a moment away from the attention of others. I waited a few seconds before following at a distance that would not draw notice, careful not to let my presence become obvious. The corridor was quieter, the sound of the memorial service now distant, replaced by the faint hum of air moving through the old building. Jessica stopped near a small open doorway leading into a side lounge, where I could hear voices again, softer, more relaxed, belonging to people who had stepped away from the formal atmosphere. I remained just outside the line of sight, close enough to hear, but hidden by the angle of the hallway. She spoke again, and this time her tone was different, lighter, almost relieved, as if a weight she had been carrying had begun to lift. I could not hear every word clearly, but I caught enough to understand that whatever she believed was happening today extended beyond simple mourning. My chest tightened slightly, not with panic, but with the recognition that something beneath the surface was beginning to reveal itself. I reminded myself again to remain steady, to avoid rushing toward conclusions before all pieces had been seen. The memory of Daniel returned briefly, not as a wave of emotion, but as a quiet reminder of why I was paying such close attention to every detail unfolding around me. He had always valued clarity, truth, and patience, and I felt, in that moment, that I was being guided by the same principles he once encouraged me to trust. Jessica laughed softly at something said inside the lounge, a sound that did not belong in this place, and then she spoke again, lowering her voice as if sharing something she did not want carried back into the main hall. I leaned slightly closer, just enough to catch the rhythm of her words without stepping into view, my attention narrowing as I prepared myself for whatever truth might be waiting just beyond what I could currently understand. The faint sound of Jessica's voice drifted through the side lounge doorway, mixing with the low murmur of conversation and the occasional soft clink of glassware being set down on a table. I stayed just beyond the edge of visibility, my body still, my breathing controlled, as I focused entirely on the rhythm of her speech. She was speaking differently now, no longer with the carefully constructed tone of grief she had used in the main hall, but with something looser, something closer to relief. I pressed myself closer to the corridor wall, careful not to let my shadow cross into the open space, and listened as she spoke to a small group of people I could not yet fully identify. One of them laughed softly, and Jessica responded with a tone that suggested familiarity, as if they were discussing something that had been planned long before today. My mind began to tighten around the fragments I could hear, trying to place meaning onto incomplete sentences, trying to understand what she believed was finally reaching its conclusion. I heard Daniel's name again, spoken not with sorrow, but with a kind of finality that made my chest feel briefly constricted, though I did not allow that feeling to surface outwardly. Instead, I remained anchored, my hand resting lightly against the cool painted wall, reminding myself that reactions without understanding were dangerous. Jessica stepped slightly closer to the doorway, and I instinctively leaned back just enough to remain hidden, my eyes fixed on her silhouette as it shifted under the soft lighting. She lowered her voice, and though I could not hear every word, I caught phrases that suggested release, completion, and something being no longer necessary to maintain. A quiet tension formed inside me, not fear, but the recognition that I was witnessing a moment of honesty she did not intend for everyone to hear. One of her friends responded, asking something I could not fully distinguish, and Jessica gave a short reply followed by a faint exhale that sounded almost like satisfaction. My thoughts moved carefully, connecting her earlier words from the chapel to this moment, the phrase I had overheard before now echoing in my memory with greater weight. Now I can finally. The sentence had been incomplete, but here, in this quieter space, its edges felt closer to definition. I remained still, allowing the conversation to continue without interruption, knowing that forcing clarity too soon would only cause the truth to retreat again into shadows. Jessica shifted her weight, leaning slightly against the edge of a small table inside the lounge, and I noticed the ease in her posture, the absence of the tension she had maintained in front of the other guests. There was a confidence in her stillness now, as if she believed the hardest part of the day had already passed without complication. I observed the subtle movements of her hands as she gestured while speaking, small precise motions that suggested control rather than emotion. The others around her seemed comfortable, unaware of anything unusual in her tone or choice of words. Yet to me each phrase carried a different weight, each pause a possible opening into something hidden. I thought of Daniel again, not as a memory of grief, but as a question that had not yet been answered. The silence between Jessica's words began to feel significant, as if it held more meaning than the words themselves. I shifted slightly, careful to maintain my position in the corridor, and continued listening as she spoke again, her voice lowering once more into something almost confidential. There was mention of arrangements, of steps that had already been taken, and of timing that aligned too precisely with the events of the day to be coincidence. I did not interrupt, did not reveal myself, but instead allowed the information to settle slowly, like pieces of a pattern forming just beyond immediate recognition. The lounge felt separate from the rest of the building, a place where honesty could slip through cracks unnoticed, and I realized that Jessica believed herself completely safe in that separation. My gaze remained steady, my expression neutral, as I absorbed everything I could without altering the moment. The sound of her laughter returned briefly, softer this time, and it carried a tone that did not match the setting of remembrance just a few rooms away. I tightened my focus, understanding that what I was hearing was not simply conversation, but the surface of something deeper that had been unfolding long before I arrived at this chapel. And as Jessica continued speaking, unaware of how closely her words were now being observed, I understood that the quiet patience I had been holding on to was no longer just restraint, but the beginning of clarity. I stepped quietly back into the main hall, the soft hum of whispered condolences and the gentle shuffle of chairs creating a muted backdrop that felt almost protective, as though it separated me from the private conversation I had just overheard. The light from the tall stained glass windows stretched across the polished floorboards in angled stripes, highlighting dust particles that floated like tiny specks of awareness suspended in the air. I moved slowly, deliberately, keeping a neutral expression as I observed the gathering from a distance, noting the placement of every guest, the subtle nods exchanged between familiar faces, and the careful way Jessica continued to position herself near the altar. She was attentive to every detail, adjusting a program here, a flower arrangement there, as if ensuring that each element reflected perfectly on her and, by extension, on the memory of Daniel. Yet beneath the surface of her meticulous gestures, I could sense the quiet orchestration of her own interests. I allowed myself a moment to glance at the folded programs resting on a small table, each one marked with Daniel's name, his life condensed into a series of lines, and I remembered how much he had valued fairness, clarity, and the well-being of those around him. The contrast between that memory and the controlled movements of Jessica before me sharpened my focus, emphasizing the need for observation rather than immediate reaction. I noticed her angle as she leaned slightly toward the front pews, offering brief smiles and nods, and yet each motion seemed calculated, as though every shift of her weight and turn of her head had been rehearsed in advance. I remained still, counting the small details, the way she brushed her hair from her face, the subtle lift of her eyebrows as she responded to a comment, the slight downward tilt of her lips when she thought no one was watching. Each movement, each nuance was information, a small thread that could later be woven into a larger understanding of her intentions. From my position, I could see other guests casting occasional glances at her, noting her poise and composure, but missing the undercurrent of purpose I had begun to sense. I focused on the moments that seemed inconsistent, the brief pauses, the flickers of expression that did not align with the somber tone of the event. The quiet rhythm of the service continued, with soft organ music punctuating the intervals of speech and reflection, yet my attention remained entirely on Jessica and the subtle dynamics that surrounded her. I adjusted my stance slightly, letting my hand rest lightly against the edge of a wooden pew, grounding myself, and I considered the implications of what I had already overheard, the unfinished sentence that had captured my attention. The words lingered in my mind, their meaning still partially obscured but now layered with the visual cues I had gathered, forming the beginnings of a picture I could almost see in full clarity. I felt the steady rhythm of my heartbeat, a reminder that calm patience could reveal more than immediate confrontation ever could. Jessica moved again, her gestures fluid and precise, and I continued to observe, noting the timing, the direction of her gaze, the subtle changes in her tone as she interacted with the guests near the front. Everything she did was now filtered through the lens of understanding. Each small action a piece of a puzzle I was slowly beginning to assemble. I reminded myself that I did not yet know the full scope of her intentions, that patience and careful observation were my allies, and that the quiet accumulation of these details would eventually reveal what was hidden beneath the surface of her polished composure. I shifted slightly, keeping my body language neutral, as the soft echoes of music and conversation filled the space, and I prepared myself to continue following, quietly, patiently, aware that the clarity I sought would come not from haste, but from the steady collection of moments that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. I followed Jessica at a careful distance as she moved through the side lounge, her voice lowered further, a soft cadence that suggested confidence and control. The faint light filtering through a nearby window caught the subtle highlights in her hair, making her appear almost luminescent against the muted backdrop of the room. I remained near the doorway, my hands resting lightly at my sides, as every gesture, every shift of posture, was absorbed into my awareness. She spoke again, mentioning documents and arrangements, words that carried implications I was beginning to piece together, fragments of plans that might have influenced events leading to Daniel's memorial. I noticed the way she smiled at one of the friends standing close, a controlled tilt of the lips that suggested satisfaction without revealing its full intent. The others in the lounge nodded or murmured softly, seemingly unaware of the underlying currents in the conversation, their casual attention providing Jessica with a sense of invisibility she did not have in the main hall. I adjusted my footing slightly, careful not to make a sound, and allowed my eyes to sweep over the subtle details. The slight lean of her shoulder, the gentle curve of her hands as they moved with her speech, the micro pauses that punctuated her words and hinted at thoughtfulness or calculation. Each moment, though seemingly ordinary to anyone else, was another clue that layered onto the pattern forming in my mind. I recalled small interactions from the earlier parts of the day, how she had guided people subtly, positioning herself as both caretaker and orchestrator, ensuring that the memorial progressed according to a rhythm only she controlled. My attention drifted briefly to the framed photograph of Daniel, placed on the side table near the lounge entrance, his calm smile frozen in time, and I felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that observation and patience would reveal the truths she had worked to conceal. Jessica turned slightly to address another friend, her voice soft, measured, almost confidential, and I noted the precise way her eyes scanned the room before focusing on the person she addressed, a ritual that suggested awareness beyond mere conversation. I remained still, allowing her to finish speaking while absorbing every movement, every nuance, the atmosphere dense with subtleties that required quiet, concentrated attention. The hum of the air conditioning, the faint shuffle of the floorboards under passing feet, the soft reflections of light across polished surfaces, all of it became part of the sensory map I used to track the unfolding dynamics. I felt no rush to intervene or to confront. Instead, I allowed each detail to settle into my memory, forming the outlines of what could later be understood as a deliberate sequence of actions and intentions. The confidence in her gestures contrasted sharply with the controlled calm I maintained, each of us moving through the space according to different awareness, one of observation, the other of orchestrated presence. I pressed my back lightly against the cool wall of the hallway, the texture grounding me as I continued to follow, careful to remain unseen, absorbing the rhythm of speech and movement, storing each subtle cue as a piece of a puzzle that I would eventually examine in full. As Jessica adjusted the placement of a chair and tilted her head slightly to confer quietly with her companion, I felt the growing clarity of understanding, the first faint outlines of a map revealing the intentions behind every careful word and gesture that had shaped this day. I remained in position near the corridor entrance, the weight of everything I had observed settling into a steady, organized awareness rather than emotion. The service inside the main hall continued at a subdued rhythm, voices rising and falling in soft waves, but my attention was now anchored almost entirely to the side lounge where Jessica remained engaged in conversation. Her tone had shifted again, slightly more relaxed, as if the earlier caution had given way to familiarity and control. I watched as she moved a few steps closer to the window, allowing the afternoon light to fall across her face. And in that moment her expression revealed a clarity that was no longer hidden behind grief or ceremony. She was speaking about timing again, about what would happen next, and I noticed how carefully she structured her sentences, pausing only where she intended emphasis, guiding the reactions of those listening to her. I did not move closer, but I adjusted my stance just enough to maintain a clear line of hearing, my focus narrowing as I began to connect her words with the fragments I had already gathered. There were references to decisions already made, to steps that had been completed, and to outcomes that seemed to depend on the completion of this day. Each phrase added another layer to a structure I was beginning to recognize, not fully formed yet, but no longer random or isolated. I thought again of Daniel, not as a memory of grief, but as a point of stability in my understanding, someone who would have insisted on clarity where there was now only carefully constructed ambiguity. Jessica's voice softened briefly as one of her companions asked a question I could not hear clearly, and she responded with a short, confident statement that seemed to end the discussion rather than invite further inquiry. I observed the reaction of the others, noting how easily they accepted her framing, how quickly the conversation returned to lighter tones after she had spoken. It was not authority in the formal sense, but something more subtle, a kind of social control that shaped the direction of attention without appearing forceful. I let my gaze drift briefly across the lounge, noting the placement of objects, the arrangement of seating, the proximity of exits, all details that might later help reconstruct the flow of events. Jessica checked her phone briefly, her expression unchanged, then slipped it back into her hand without breaking her conversation. The movement was small, almost invisible, but it suggested coordination beyond the immediate space, as if she were tracking something external to the room itself. I remained patient, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption, trusting that the accumulation of detail would eventually reveal what direct questioning could not. A soft sound from the main hall drifted in, the continuation of the memorial proceedings, a reminder that the formal structure of the day was still in place even as something more complex unfolded in its margins. Jessica shifted her weight again, turning slightly so that her voice carried less toward the corridor and more toward the inner circle of her audience, and I recognized the intention behind the adjustment. She was refining her control of the space, narrowing the reach of her words while increasing their impact on those closest to her. I absorbed each detail carefully, aware that nothing she did was accidental, and that every gesture contributed to a larger design I was only beginning to comprehend. The longer I observed, the more certain I became that what I had initially taken as isolated remarks were in fact connected elements of a single, deliberate sequence. I pressed my fingertips lightly against the edge of the wall once more, grounding myself in its physical presence as I continued to listen, watch, and remember, knowing that the truth, whatever form it ultimately took, would reveal itself not in sudden revelation, but in the steady alignment of details that were now slowly, inevitably coming into focus. I stayed near the same corridor position, but the atmosphere inside the building had subtly shifted, as if the memorial itself was moving toward an unseen conclusion that only a few people were aware of. Jessica had returned closer to the main lounge entrance, her posture once again composed for public observation, yet I had already seen enough of her private tone to recognize the difference between performance and intention. She was speaking less now, listening more, allowing others to fill the space around her words while she guided the flow with minimal effort. I watched as she acknowledged a passing guest with a soft nod, her expression carefully neutral, and then subtly repositioned herself closer to a side table, where several documents had been placed earlier in the day. My attention sharpened immediately, because that movement felt intentional in a way that was not casual or social. I did not approach, but I adjusted my angle slightly to maintain visibility, allowing me to observe without disrupting the pattern I had been carefully tracking. A man in a dark suit approached her briefly, speaking in a low tone, and I noticed the way Jessica responded with immediate confidence, as if she had been expecting the interaction. She accepted a small folder from him, holding it for only a moment before placing it beside her without looking inside. Yet the exchange itself carried significance that I could not ignore. The man left almost immediately afterward, blending back into the crowd of attendees, while Jessica remained in place, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table. I observed her eyes shift toward the main hall, then briefly toward the corridor where I stood, though she did not linger there long enough to suggest awareness of my presence. Still, I remained motionless, trusting distance and silence to preserve my position. Inside the lounge, her friends continued speaking in fragments, but Jessica's attention had narrowed, her responses now shorter, more deliberate. I noticed the slight tightening of her expression when a particular topic arose, something related to timing or confirmation, though the exact words were unclear. She reached once more for her phone, this time holding it slightly longer, scrolling with a measured focus before locking the screen and returning it to her side. Each of these small actions contributed to a growing sense that she was operating within a framework of decisions already made, not reacting to the present, but following a sequence established earlier. I thought again of the phrase I had overheard before, now carrying more weight than when I first heard it, as if it were part of a larger sentence I was still in the process of uncovering. The memorial service continued in the background, voices occasionally rising from the main hall as another speaker approached the podium, but even those sounds felt secondary compared to the quiet precision of what I was witnessing here. Jessica stepped slightly away from the table and spoke again, this time in a tone that suggested closure, as though a final condition had been met or confirmed. The people around her responded with subtle nods, their attention gradually dispersing as the conversation reached its natural endpoint. I observed how quickly the group dissolved into individual movement, how seamlessly she transitioned from central focus to background presence, as if nothing significant had just occurred. Yet I knew better than to dismiss these transitions as ordinary, because they formed part of a pattern I could no longer unsee. I shifted my weight carefully, maintaining my distance while continuing to observe her as she began walking slowly toward the edge of the lounge, her expression calm and resolved. The corridor between us remained empty, but I understood that something within this day had already changed direction, even if the formal structure of the memorial had not yet reflected it. I stayed where I was, allowing silence and observation to remain my tools, knowing that whatever Jessica believed was concluding, I was only beginning to understand its true shape. I stayed near the edge of the corridor, letting the muffled echoes of the service continue in the background while my focus remained sharply on Jessica as she moved with quiet confidence through the lounge. Each step she took was measured, each glance intentional, as though she were aware of the patterns of attention around her and directing them subtly to reinforce her presence. She paused briefly to straighten the arrangement of a small stack of memorial programs, her fingers lingering over the edges before stepping back just enough to observe the effect of her adjustment. I watched the slight tilt of her head, the way her eyes swept over the room, noting who was watching, who was speaking, and who remained oblivious to the undercurrents she controlled. The afternoon light shifted, streaking across the polished floors and catching the highlights of her hair, and I recognized that her calm exterior hid the layers of calculation I had been tracing throughout the day. I allowed myself to catalog every small movement, the gentle lift of her hand to adjust a bracelet, the measured pause before answering a whispered question, the subtle shift of her weight to capture attention without overt display. Each detail, each fragment of gesture, formed a cumulative map that was gradually revealing the structure of her intentions. I considered the implications of what I had overheard earlier, the careful timing and phrasing of her words, and began to piece together a sequence that suggested premeditation rather than chance. Jessica moved toward the window at the far end of the room, pausing to look out at the courtyard, her expression calm, almost reflective, though I knew the ease of her demeanor was part of a carefully maintained image. I remained behind the wall, observing her from an angle that allowed me full visibility while preserving my own concealment, noting the way she gestured subtly to her companions, guiding their focus and attention as effortlessly as a conductor leading an orchestra. I allowed the faint sounds from the main hall, the soft rustle of programs, the low murmurs of guests, the occasional clearing of a throat, to fade into background noise, focusing entirely on the interactions within the lounge. A visitor approached Jessica briefly, and I observed the brief exchange, noting the subtle way she received and returned the contact, her posture relaxed yet purposeful, her movements economical but precise. I cataloged each aspect, timing, placement, response, tone, as a part of the growing pattern I had been reconstructing in my mind, careful not to allow anticipation or emotion to influence my observations. The light continued to shift across the room, illuminating small details on the table and floor, each reflection a potential clue that contributed to the overall understanding of the scene. I remained patient, aware that the quiet accumulation of information and careful attention to gesture, tone, and placement would reveal more than confrontation ever could. The lounge felt still, almost suspended in time, and within that stillness, I recognized the subtle currents of intention that had governed Jessica's actions from the moment the memorial had begun. I pressed lightly against the edge of the wall, grounding myself as I continued to track her movements, her subtle expressions, and the unfolding sequence of actions, knowing that clarity would emerge not from haste, but from the careful, deliberate observation that allowed the truth to surface naturally, piece by piece. I remained still, the quiet hum of the memorial service behind me blending with the faint rustle of papers and soft steps echoing in the lounge. Jessica had moved toward the far side of the room, her posture calm and deliberate, each motion reflecting control rather than distraction. I noted the subtle shifts in her expression, the way her eyes scanned the surrounding guests as if assessing the effectiveness of her actions, the faint curl of her lips indicating satisfaction at something only she understood. I traced her gestures carefully, observing the brief pause as she lifted a program to glance at the printed names, a small adjustment that seemed minor but carried weight in the orchestration she maintained throughout the day. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, striking the polished wooden floor in golden beams that highlighted dust motes floating in the air like silent witnesses. I pressed gently against the wall, feeling the cool texture grounding me as I followed the unfolding scene, each detail adding to the emerging pattern of intention and planning. Jessica spoke softly to one of her companions, leaning slightly toward them, her words measured, deliberate, conveying information in fragments that suggested careful planning without revealing the full picture. I cataloged each motion, each pause, each modulation in tone, Recognizing how her control over the space and the timing of her interactions created a network of subtle influence that guided the flow of attention and perception around her. I reflected on Daniel's memory, not as grief, but as an anchor to discern truth, noting how his presence lingered in the arrangements of the day and in the expectations of those around us. Jessica adjusted her stance, turning slightly to allow her words to reach only a select few, her body. Language reinforcing her authority over the immediate environment without attracting notice. I observed the reactions of those she addressed, noting their casual compliance, their lack of awareness of the underlying currents that I had begun to perceive. Each fragment of conversation, each gesture, was being stored and analyzed in my mind, forming a map of intentions and outcomes that extended beyond the visible actions of the present moment. The room felt almost suspended, time stretching as I absorbed the interplay of movement and speech, every small detail a key to understanding the broader narrative that had been unfolding quietly beneath the surface. I allowed the soft echo of organ music from the main hall to blend with the subtle background noises, letting it fade so that my focus remained solely on the interactions that mattered, on the alignment of actions and intentions that Jessica revealed without realizing she was being observed. A gentle shift in her stance, a brief nod to another guest, and the lowering of her voice marked a transition, a subtle signal that one phase of her orchestration was complete and another quietly commencing. I did not move, did not interrupt, but continued to track her movements, aware that clarity would come not from confrontation, but from the patient assembly of each observed detail. And as I stood there, quietly collecting evidence from gesture, tone, and sequence, I felt the outline of the full picture begin to emerge, a faint but undeniable understanding of the intentions and calculations that had guided Jessica throughout the day, preparing the stage for the eventual revelation that would not need force or haste, only the accumulation of careful, precise observation.